Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Stuart Cohen from IGI Cyber Labs. We'll get started in just a few minutes. I want to thank you very much for logging into today's session with Steve Mancini. Just give us a couple of minutes while we're waiting for some people to log in. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for some people to log into today's session, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Be thinking about if you have any questions specifically for Steve and about DHS and CISA and what they're doing to help small businesses. If you put them in the chat or question box, we'll have an opportunity to get to those during today's session, or we'll follow up with you afterwards. Thank you very much. We'll get started in just a second. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, my name is Stuart Cohen. I'm the president of IGI Cyber Labs. I want to thank you very much for attending today's session. This is on our ongoing series with our SMB educational webinar series designed specifically to help small businesses, business owners, C-level executives on how they can begin to get started as it relates to cybersecurity, cyber hygiene. But most importantly, how can they take a few simple steps to make sure their data is more confidential than it was the day before? Make sure the integrity of their systems are greater than they were the day before. And most importantly, as if an attack happens to come your way, what can you do from a business continuity standpoint to make sure that your business is back up and running as quickly as possible? Because at the end of the day, it's really around your business and your business opportunity and growing your business and having your business be successful. And cybersecurity, whether it's education or training or tools, should not get in the way of you running your business. It should be very complementary to the way you run your business. We're fortunate enough to have Steve Mancini with us today. He's an IT specialist with CISA. He'll be talking specifically about, some of the things that the Department of Homeland Security and CISA have been doing specifically to help small businesses with the issues that they face, the issues that come their way. We will get started in just a second with that. Let me go to a few housekeeping things before, just to get started. First of all, we'd like this to be interactive. A number of you have submitted questions in advance, and we very much appreciate that. We will get to those questions on today's session. If you have follow-on questions after the event, please join us on our LinkedIn event, specifically to ask questions, to collaborate with your peers, and to work in a collaborative fashion with a peer-to-peer conversations. Also, make sure if there are other topics and other presenters you're interested in hearing from in our series, let us know that, and we will do our best to get those different topics and those different presenters. And also, there will be a recording. This is something that always gets asked. There will be a recording that gets sent out after this event. There'll be a copy of the slides that are included with the recording. So you'll be able to follow that, send that, forward that to other people as well. There's a couple of things that I'd also like to do before we get started. One, there's been so much conversation with the White House letter that came out to business leaders and to corporate executives about what people are doing to get ready and some things they can do. We are fortunate enough to have Steve today to help us with that conversation. But if we can go to the next slide, we also have the next few webinars we have coming up. One specifically, the next one is with a couple of executives from different managed service providers around the country, talking about how managed service providers can help small businesses, how you can grow your business, and how you can leverage technology. Once again, it's critically important to be able to leverage the technology, but not have the technology take over your time and attention. Second of all, with the push towards compliance, we have Tony Sager, one of the industry icons around compliance from the Center of Internet Security, talking about the new CISA 18 and what they've put in place and how you can get started with that. And then we will have Bradford Willke from CISA, the senior advisor, come back and talk specifically about what CISA is doing as it relates to helping organizations support remote and hybrid workforces, since that is still the, that is the new norm for the way businesses will be moving forward. So we've got a number of things going on in that area. So we'll put these links to register in the chat box later in today's session, so you'll have them if you want to attend them as well. And once again, submit questions in advance, participate on LinkedIn, and we'll continue to provide as much as we can for you in these, what we think of as public service announcements around educating end user organizations. So with that, before we get started, we have a couple of poll questions that were specific to today's audience. So if you could help answer these questions, we're only going to leave them up for a short period of time. But if you can put them up for a second, we can get people to answer them. It may help drive some of the conversation and some of the comments that Steve wants to make as it relates to CISA and DHS and some of the things they're doing. So I want to thank people for just filling this one out. We'll just leave it up for a couple of seconds longer to let people kind of vote for their specific areas. And then we will move on to the next one. Just so you know, so far on that last poll, just so you know, about 50%, as you can see, either own or work for a managed service provider or work for a small business. So it's very much, or excuse me, 44% own a small or medium-sized business or work for a small and medium-sized business. So we want to make sure that that we're providing that kind of information for what people are looking for. If we can go to the next poll question. Just to give Steve a feel for if the organizations are beginning to use those tools that are available, and we'll obviously get this back to Bradford Willke. We'll also get this back to the folks at the National Cybersecurity Alliance that are involved with National Cybersecurity Monthly Awareness, and the work that we're doing with InfraGard and others, just to make people better educated and better prepared for the activities that are going on around cybersecurity, specifically for small businesses. As you can see, an even split, pretty sure, between who's using the tools and who's not using the tools. I think that kind of begins to, Steve, it gives you a little bit of insight as to what's going on. We've had over 100 people vote on each one of these, so you got a pretty good representation about the number of organizations that are on today's call that are participating. So with that, I'd like to go back to Steve. I'd like to introduce Steve Mancini. I'd like to thank him for participating in today's session with us. And Steve, if you could provide us a little bit of an overview of some of the things going on at DHS and CISA, we'd really appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Stuart, appreciate that. Before I kind of jump into CISA, I do want to introduce myself. And I was kind of mentioning to Stuart beforehand that I actually was not a Fed. I'm not a lifelong Fed. I actually came over from the private sector a couple years ago. Before I came back to DHS to work on the CIHI program, I was the Chief Technology Officer and Director of Strategic Operations for the National Cyber Forensics and Training Alliance, which is an information sharing entity that works, it's a nonprofit. We worked with law enforcement, international law enforcement, and a lot of companies across multiple sectors, small, medium, and large size. So us being a nonprofit, a smaller organization, like I was explaining to Stuart, understand a lot of the challenges that a lot of you are having. And I kind of saw that in the questions that were presented in advance. I said, I know exactly what they're asking, because I asked a lot of the same questions when I was the CTO, Director of Strategic Ops. So when we kind of get to the Q&A portion, I will talk about obviously DHS CIHI spin on things, but I also will offer up my personal opinion on a few things, because I think that just because you're a small organization does not mean there are not things that you can do to be effective. It also does not mean that you need large sums of money to do those things to be effective, or large staffs in general. So we can talk about that in a little bit. But what I want to do now is kind of talk about the cyber hygiene services. So looking at the pool, and it said, 39% were using, DHS services, tools, whatever. That could be interpreted in a lot of ways. It could be simply, hey, I've gone out to the website, I downloaded your CSET tool, or I've gone out and I used some of your advisor, or I've used some of your best practices, or it could mean I'm actually subscribing to some of the services that are offered. And so I'm going to kind of focus on the services that are offered that are available to you right now for free. So as I stated, I was in the private sector before I came. I was fed a military a long time ago, retired military, was DHS, left DHS, went out to the private sector for about 5.5 years. About 2 years ago, I came back to DHS to head one of these services, the web application scanning, to actually stand it up, which I'll talk about in a second. But I was brought into a program called Cyber Hygiene. At the time, about two years ago, there was one service that was available that came out of Cyber Hygiene that I suspect a few of you may be leveraging, and that's the vulnerability scanning. So the vulnerability scanning is kind of our oldest service, and what that is very simple. If you own your own IP range, let's say you have, a managed service, an ISP, and you have on-premise solutions, you're not using cloud, and you have dedicated IPs for your organization, you can sign up for the vulnerability scanning service, provide those IPs, and what they will do is a weekly scan of your IPs, and then they will provide you a report of the findings. So let's say, hey, you gave us a /24, there's 43 hosts that are live, they're running these services, and you got some criticals, some mediums, some lows, but you get this weekly report saying, hey, here's what we're finding based on those IP ranges. It's a very straightforward service. It's very useful because it's kind of, a lot of people say, well, I don't know where to begin. Well, that's the first place I would want to begin, is if I own my own IP addresses, what can an adversary see on my perimeter? I own the IPs. I have devices on these, they're assigned IP addresses. They're publicly accessible. What can the adversary see? What services am I running? And then are those services vulnerable to any known exploits? Another thing I will throw on that is, I've seen this a lot, especially in smaller organizations, especially in smaller colleges and universities. They'll spin up servers, publicly accessible servers, maybe part of a school, or it was part of a beta testing, or it was their dev site, whatever, and they forget to take them down. And so they think, hey, I'm live on this server, and we're good and we're patched, and then they kind of forget about these other things that are out there. That's the nice thing about the vulnerability scanning, is it says, you give me your IP range that you own, we'll scan it, we will identify hosts, and we'll tell you what's out there. We have found things out there that people said, oops, I didn't know that was out there. We thought we took that down. So it's a little bit of a discovery, but that's not the entire intent of it, but that's naturally going to be a byproduct, because if you give me a /24 and say, scan my /24, I'm going to look for up hosts, and then on those hosts, I'm going to look for the services that are running, and then I'm going to notify you of what I find. So that is a free service. You can literally send an email to the vulnerability_info and say, hey, I'm interested in Cyber Hygiene's vulnerability scanning service, and they'll send you some forms, you fill it out, Once you agree, they'll give you a start date, and it's pretty quick, usually within a few weeks of the paperwork being received, and they start scanning. And again, it's a weekly service. So I think we want to hold questions to the end, but that is one of the 3 services that we're offering. And again, it's available. All you do is fill out the paperwork, and you get right away. I'm going to skip to the web application scanning. So the web application scanning is very similar. Instead of giving me the IP addresses you own, you give me your domains, URLs, web apps that are publicly accessible. We scan them usually on a monthly basis. We use commercial tools for all of our scanning. So with the vulnerability scanning, we use Nessus and Nmap to map it, and commercial stuff that's available. For the web application, we use Qualys. So you give me your URLs, your domains, I put them into Qualys. I run monthly unauthenticated scans, and I give you a report and say, here's the domains we scanned, here's what we found. We'll be back in a month. The nice thing from a private sector is I would sure like it if you fixed those vulnerabilities as soon as possible, but we're not twisting your arm saying, hey, we found an urgent and you need to fix it. To be very blunt, you'd be foolish to not fix critical and urgent findings if you had that within your means. However, I also understand that that is part of the challenge. You've found these bad things and I really want to fix them, but I don't have the resources to fix them. Maybe we outsourced our development 6 months ago, signed up for your service and found all these criticals, but unfortunately those developers are gone. Now what do we do? So we can address that in the Q&A session, but suffice to say, the services are free. There's no arm twisting for private sector or local or state. Only federal is mandated under the vulnerability scanning to fix findings within a certain time frame. But for smaller organizations, private sector, local entities, state entities, we'll scan it, we'll provide you the findings. And ideally, you want to fix those as soon as possible, because we're going to come back with a web application scanning in another month, and we're going to do it again. And the good thing is you have a month to fix them, which is a little different, because in the vulnerability scanning, a lot of that is patching. But with web applications, since it's an application essentially, a lot of that, there might be some patching, but a lot of that is more on code development. That's why you're looking for CWEs with web applications versus CVEs you'll be looking for on vulnerability scanning. So with web application, we're putting a month between the scans to give you some time to to kind of go into the findings, see what you can fix, make the adjustments, maybe do some testing development on your side. But we could mark that as, we could flag it and say, don't scan it next month because you're working on it. Or we could even do an out-of-band scan. You say, listen, we did a whole bunch of major fixes, and we really don't want to wait 3 weeks for the next scan. Can you do it now? Sure, we can do that. So these services are available. Fill out the paperwork. The thing about the web application scanning, though, that I want to add is a lot of folks, especially smaller and mid-sized entities, and even larger entities nowadays, are not owning their own IP range. They say, well, I can't do the vulnerability scanning because we're cloud hosted. The good news is, with the web application scanning, that's okay. You don't have to own the infrastructure. We just need to be able to get to your web application, which is most likely going to be your public website. So services are available. You send an email to vulnerability info, say, I'm interested. They send you the forms. You fill it out. The last one I'll mention, phishing campaign assessments. Again, another free service. Very much what it says it is. You go through these campaigns. It's a 6-week campaign. You identify individuals that you want phished. You provide the contact info to the team. Week 1, they pick some of them. They send, an easy phish. Oh, everybody should know this is a phish. We all know people will still click the links. But as the campaign progresses, the idea is that the phishes get harder and harder, so that by week 6, they're much more difficult to spot. But there will always be some telltale sign that, yes, this is really a phish if you're looking for it. And at the end, it's not a gotcha game. It's all about, click rates, report rates. Did they, maybe they fell for some of the harder stuff, but you know what? The easier stuff, they got it. So it's just an idea for you as an organization to say, okay, what is the click rate of my employees? If you guys are familiar with the Verizon Verus report, I think, I've seen numbers as high as 90-something% of all breaches start with phishing. So even the most advanced persistent threat actors out there, I can tell you, having been doing this for years, usually start their campaigns by phishing folks, getting somebody to click some link, open some attachment, ta-da, I've got somebody's machine compromised, and then I try and lateral move around the network based on the configurations inside the network, but at least I have a foothold on the network. So most breaches are actually going to come through phishing or some kind of web application vulnerability. That is not to say that there's not other ways that they're going to breach, but what it is the adversary is going to look for the low-hanging fruit. These three services represent the low-hanging fruit. So if you do own your own IPs and you're patching and you're staying on top of that, and you're training your employees not to click links and open up attachments, and you've got your mail filtering is on, it's doing a pretty good job of blocking all the phishing attempts, and you're scanning your web apps and you've got developers looking at stuff, it doesn't mean you won't get breached despite all of that. But what it does mean is ideally you won't be a low-hanging fruit that someone comes along, some mediocre hacker says, aha, they've got wide open ports and I'm going to get on their network, no problem. I mean, you at the end of the day, you want to make it as difficult as you can for the adversary, because the more difficult it is for them, you have a better chance that they say, I can't get in, let me try a different way and go somewhere else. Believe me, if you have something worth stealing, they're going to stay on it. But you want to make it so I'm going to make the adversary really work for this, and ideally they're never going to get in. But if they do, it's going to be so difficult for them. And even if they're in, we're going to spot it right away. We've got our network segmented, we've got internal systems in place. We're going to make it very hard for the adversary. So these three services are kind of looking at the front door, of your organization, from the IPs. What do you got running? Are they patched? The emails coming into your employees, okay, are they clicking links? Are they clicking anything? I remember way back when I was active duty and I was a comm officer, and we used to hear stories, people would literally go into the spam filters and pull things back into the inbox so they could click the links. And you're just like, why would they do that? The old adage, curiosity killed the cat. Well, don't underestimate what I'll use the word curiosity. Some people might say stupidity, but I'll say don't underestimate the curiosity of people to want to click the link or open the attachment. So, you want to minimize the likelihood that your employees are going to do that. And obviously, I would suspect that most of you have some kind of web presence, you have some kind of website, you have some kind of form, some kind of login, some kind of customer form, something. And ideally, that's where the web application scanning is going to try and look at that and say, okay, is there anything obvious here that an adversary could exploit right away to get into the back end of the system? So as I noted before, these services are free. The vulnerability scanning and the web app scanning are pretty quick to get those services. Once you fill out the paperwork, you can usually get that started right away. The phishing might take a little longer because there's a little more of a manual aspect to that. So they literally put you kind of in queues and then kind of pull that out. So you might not get your phishing assessments right away, but the important thing is you ask for all of the services you can possibly ask for. And, maybe you get lucky and you get in right away. Maybe they put you on a waiting list, but nonetheless, you can at least get a few things right away, i.e. the vulnerability scanning, web application scanning. So those are the services for cyber hygiene that are offered. They're available to you right now. I know I'm going to kind of jump ahead to one of the questions, and these services do not require that you have a security staff or an IT staff. It just requires that somebody is managing your services. So a smaller organization may outsource to a third party and say, well, they handle our websites, they handle all of our development, they handle our infrastructure. Okay, but somebody is ultimately responsible, and they're going to be the ones signing the paperwork, and they're going to be the ones saying, here's where the reports go to. And then you as the organization can then do with it what you will. It's your report. So the requirement is not that I have to have some super high-tech team that can fix these things immediately. The requirement is that you own what you're asking us to evaluate, and then what you do with it is entirely up to you after that. So I figured I just wanted to mention that. So with that being said, Stuart, I will kind of turn it back to you for some questions.
It's interesting you talked about the free vulnerability management scanning. And, we had somebody that was on the call last month, and they had actually taken advantage of the program, and they got the monthly reports from you. And then they implemented Nodeware because they were interested in getting, immediate alerts. because they had so many people working remote and so many people working in a hybrid environment, that they needed the immediate learning capability of what was happening on their network on a regular basis, because they didn't think 30 days was frequent enough. Can you comment a little bit about, how do you handle going from, let's say, nothing to 30 days to the requirement for immediate alerts?
So you mean as far as alerting, like just the active users that are connected to the system, what's going on?
Yeah, either new devices that are coming on the system, new devices that are vulnerable, exploitable, or just in general, with people working on from their homes on Wi-Fi's. Maybe you could talk a little bit about kind of the need for that, or as you see the market moving.
That's a good question. It's a deep question, and I'll tell you why. This goes back to many years ago when we were starting to have the conversation on bring your own device. And this is, and if you really think about it, this is kind of an extension of bring your own device. What's the real difference? Well, unless you're an organization that has issued the equipment to your employees, okay, which means you've built the client, you have the VPN software on there, you limit what the user can put on their computer. The only difference is, are they physically on premise or are they remote and tunneling in? Well, if you built the computer, what is the difference? Really, in Steve's opinion, not much. I think the only challenge is to make sure that I'm using, and this is IT 101 stuff. Am I using a legitimate VPN service? When the user authenticates, is it dual factor authentication just in case the laptop gets lost or user credentials get compromised? Is the system, constantly, kind of when the user authenticates in, does the system automatically do some kind of okay, let me check for compliance, and then I'm going to notify the server, hey, I'm fully, I'm patched, you've pushed the patches out to me, I'm running the antivirus, the user still only has local rights, nothing new is installed on the computer. I mean, it's not too dissimilar from what you're doing on the network, again, but with the exception is you're tunneling in. So I don't think it creates an issue because it's still not a publicly accessible asset. In other words, if I'm tunneled in to my organization, it's not like you can scan my organization and see me. You shouldn't. I should look internal through the VPN. The only thing you might see as an adversary scanning is that, hey, they've got this weird port open that looks like it's the VPN port for users to connect in and authenticate. Because somewhere in your DMZ, you're going to have an authentication server that's going to say, okay, users authenticate. So this goes back to, what does the customer want? Or what does the organization want? Are you going to build your machines, or are you going to allow users? And I'll give you a good example of that. So I also teach part-time in the evenings, and I can check my work stuff from any computer. But even though I'm in a browser logging into my school with two-factor authentication, they still say, what's your operating system? In theory, that has absolutely no bearing on their infrastructure. But if I'm still running Windows 7, I can't authenticate in through the browser. So they've decided that, hey, we are going to put some limitations on, even though you're outside and you're going through a regular web browser, we're still going to check your local machine, your device, and say, look, if your device doesn't meet these criteria, we're not going to let you log in through the browser. And the reason being is I might be compromised, but now I'm authenticated onto the network, even though it's through the browser, and therefore I introduce some risk. So fundamentally, it does come down to risk. Externally, you're not going to see these customers. The organization have to decide, are we building the machines? Are they authenticating through some tunneling software they can get through the browser? Is it a BYOD? Where users can just use their laptop, they log in through any laptop through their home Wi-Fi, they open up their little open VPN or whatever they're using, and they authenticate in. That's ultimately up to the organization. I've seen it all, but from an external perspective, I shouldn't see any of that, except that there exists some kind of server somewhere that allows external users to authenticate in, whether that's an authentication server or just going through the web server and authenticating through the website. And I hope that answered your question.
No, it does. It gets us to, one of the questions just got submitted, right? And, how do SMB leaders and owners determine what cyber initiatives to tackle first? And if you don't have anybody on your team that supports you from an IT or security standpoint, how do you go about that?
So that is the $64,000 question. By the way, I apologize, everybody, if I sound terrible. I've been fighting a cold forever, and Stuart's had to hear me complain about this cold for a while now. But what it comes down to, it's ultimately about two things. One, leadership's priorities, and two, risk. So if leadership says IT and security just aren't that important, they're probably not going to fund it very appropriately. At the same time, if they say, no, IT and security are very important. However, I can't fund it at what you want. Therefore, I have to go to risk. And, organizations have to, the bottom line is, like I said before, you got to do something, even if it's baby steps. You can't boil the ocean. So you take little steps. I don't know if we're going to hit this question, but I want to go to one of the things that was asked, and it was about certifications. And I think this ties in a little bit. Somebody had asked one of the questions. I don't think we were going to bring this up. It's one of the ones I was going to avoid, but I'm going to talk about it because I think it ties in. But somebody said, well, what certification should I get? And this kind of ties into that. It's not about, hey, we've got to get secure. We need cybersecurity is important, and we need to be cyber secure tomorrow. Okay, what does that mean? So a lot of the certifications out, whether it's some kind of NIST, if you're looking at the NIST framework, they all kind of put you on what I'll call a road that's about a journey that you're never going to get to a place. You're never going to get, quote, secure, because there's always going to be something new. But the idea of an organization is you say, listen, we want to be more secure, but you're telling us all of these threats that are out there, and then I've got employees logging in remotely, and we've got a website, and where do we begin? Well, I think it comes down to is, if you look at any kind of certification, they're always going to say, well, what have you got? Number one, what do we own? What are we responsible for? And when I look at what I've got, I say, well, what do I need out of what I've got? Okay, well, we absolutely need these things. We turn these things off because we don't need them, and they're unnecessary risks. So what do I got? What do I need? And then, from there, you start saying, okay, so how can I make what we're doing just a little more secure? And I'll give you a perfect example. It's the year 2021, and I can still log on to my bank with a username and password. Now, a bank has funding for security, but yet it's like the movie War Games in 1983. We're still using usernames and passwords. So there are things you can do that don't take a lot of money that could reduce your risk. And I'll give you another example. I'll talk about a fraud that some of you may have been victims of. It's a procedural approach. So business email compromise. Adversaries will send emails, and they love to go after small and mid-size because they know you probably don't have a lot of resources for, quote, security. Whatever security means. Is it IT security? Is it physical security? Is it just the security of my operations? What does it even mean? So they know you probably don't have a lot of funds, don't have a lot of people doing this. You probably aren't trained in this sort of stuff. So they'll send emails to whomever, secretary, the finance person, saying, hey, we're company XYZ, and you do business with us, and we need you to wire money to this bank. Oh my God, well, that we do, okay, sure. And then you wire money, and you think, oh no, people would never fall for just a simple email telling you to wire funds. Oh yes, they do. By the billions of dollars, they do. This has been going on for darn near 10 years, and I've heard the losses up to something like $20 billion, because somebody can do something as simple as send an email to somebody in an organization and say, I need you to wire $10,000 to this account, and the person will do it. I don't need to invest money to fix stuff like that. I just need to be aware of it and put procedures in place. So when you're an organization, you say, listen, we don't have a lot of bodies. That's okay. There are things you can do that can eliminate some of that low-hanging fruit that the adversary is going to take advantage of. Remember, the adversaries, in a lot of ways, they're lazy. They're looking for the easiest way to make a buck. Otherwise, they wouldn't do what they're doing. And they're trying to make a lot of bucks. So they're going to go after you. And I just told you kind of 3 ways they're going to do it through the services. They're going to scan your IPs. They're going to see if something not patched. They're going to look at your website, see is it not maintained, or there's some SQL injection vulnerabilities. I'm going to send some phishing emails and see if I can get somebody to interact. Those don't take a lot of money to reduce that kind of risk. Enabling two-factor authentication doesn't take big bucks, in Steve's opinion, to implement that kind of solution to reduce the risk that comes with usernames and passwords. So, when you say, where do I begin? Well, go look at any certification out there, because unless you're regulated and have requirements to be certified, whether it's some kind of HIPAA compliance or, some kind of PCI compliance, whatever, almost all of them look the same. They might tweak the verbiage a little bit, but they all look the same. It's all about, what do I got? What do I need? How do I train my employees? How do I bring new employees on? How do I vet them? How do I properly, if I got to get rid of employee for employee lease, how do I properly, get rid of my employees? How do I do, what's my operations? Is my documentation up to date? And a lot of that doesn't take money. And that kind of gets back to what I said before, but that's the journey piece. You never get there. Yeah, you might get the certificate on the wall. It says, oh, we're PCI compliant, or we're ISO 27001 compliant. Got it. But the minute you get that certificate, the next day you're out of compliance because a new vulnerability has been introduced. And if you're not doing those things all of the time, well, you run the risk of being breached. And so where do you begin? Start with the basics. Go look at any certification out there. Go out to the NIST and just say, what are some simple procedural things we can start with? What are some devices we absolutely maybe think about? Do we need these things publicly available? Are they locked down? I may only have one IT person, but okay, is this IT person capable of, turning on two-factor or something? So just don't try to create, a super lockdown organization overnight. It won't happen. Just identify the small things that you can do right now that immediately take you up one notch. And there's a lot of small things you can do that will immediately do that. So hope that answered your question, Stuart.
We got a follow-on question that just came in about that is, specifically if you're an SMB that's been in the middle of a ransomware attack, what do you do other than obviously pay the ransom to get back up to speed and from a business continuity standpoint, get started?
Okay, so that is a great question. And I'm going to tell you the official government position, and I support this, is never pay the ransom. However, never pay the ransom. However, you're a small organization and all of your data is on your servers and it's on-prem and you didn't have backups, you didn't have offline backups, and you just got popped by ransomware and there's no other way to get the data back. I don't know what to tell you to do. I'm still not going to tell you to pay the ransom. And I'm going to tell you why Steve's opinion, and I believe the government also has this opinion, you don't pay the ransom. Here's why. Number one, if you pay the ransom, there's no guarantees they're going to give you the key to decrypt your data. Remember, you're not dealing with good people, you're dealing with bad people. That's number one. Number two, what caused the attack in the first place? Who says they won't leave something behind? And a lot of times the adversary might say something like, well, if you pay the ransom, we won't leak your data. Oh yeah? How do you know that? So you can't trust the people you're dealing with inherently. They're criminals. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about what to do. Now, if it's already happened, I'm sorry, I don't know what to tell you to do. I'm not even going to give you advice on that, but I am going to tell you what to do if it hasn't happened. And this is the most important thing. Number one, there are a lot of tools out there, and I believe on CISA's website, we have an entire page dedicated to ransomware. So if you go out to CISA.gov, there's an entire section to ransomware, and it talks about things you can do. And there's even tools out there that might be able to help you get some of your data back, because some of the ransomware, the researchers have found ways to So take a look at CISA.gov's ransomware as resources. There's a lot of good stuff out there. But as a former CTO, I literally still had backup tapes. We may have been off by a couple of days, but if we got hit by anything, I knew I could at least recover. And if I lost a few days' data, I'll take it. So I'm not telling you to go back in time and go out and get a tape machine. But what I am telling you is, if your current data is that important that you lost it, that it's going to put you out of business, this is one of those risk priority pieces, then is it worth the investment to have an offline or some kind of backup that if that happens, I can restore, even if it's not a real-time restore? Let's say you do lose maybe even a week's worth of data. Would you rather lose it all or a week's worth of data. So this is what I talk about priorities. And for the record, and small and mid-sized businesses are hit by, I just happen to be doing research on this, and most of the time, I think it's like over 70% of all attacks are going after what's called small and mid-sized business. Why? Because you probably don't have teams to deal with IT and security issues, and adversaries know that. You're in a niche business and you do that business, and you probably do that business very well. But what you're not in the business of is IT security. Unfortunately, that has become, IT is the enabler. If you do not have effective IT, number one, you've got to ask yourself, in the year 2021, how effective can you be as an organization without effective IT, infrastructure behind you? And number two, knowing the importance of IT and knowing that we are interconnected globally with some of the worst actors in the world, can get to anywhere in the world, and let's be very blunt here, they can operate with impunity. We're not going to go arrest a lot of these people because they're in countries where we don't have extradition treaties, or where the countries, tacitly support it. Go read about a lot of these threats that are out there and look at the countries they're operating in, and we're never going to get them. Not unless they leave the country on vacation. So they're going to keep doing what they're going to keep doing and trying to make as much money as they can make. And you know what? We as a society have accepted that risk because we decided to plug everybody in. So you have to ultimately come down to is say, if my data is that important, then I'm going to spend the money to back it up in a manner that if I get popped and my network gets compromised, I still have this offline or offsite or whatever data that's going to be available that we can restore from. And that ultimately is a leadership decision that you have to make. But I also understand this. Sometimes it is about funding. Again, I worked for a small nonprofit. I understand. The funding is not always there. Your leadership might be on board and everybody wants to do it, but you just don't have the funding. I get it. So again, it goes back to then what can we do to try to mitigate some of that risk? What can be a workaround to have some of this data somewhere, even if it's external terabyte drives that you're plugging into your server and manually running a script backing up and unplugging, whatever it is. But find some way to recognize that I've got to have a way that if something bad happens, I need my data somewhere else so I can pull it back in and not be out of business. Hope that helps.
To that point, we have a lot of people that we connect with, either local, regional, or national managed service providers, that for a very, entry-level amount of money per month, they can provide, a vulnerability scan, let people know what's exploitable, implement multi-factor authentication, and provide some basics hygiene training for the employees of those companies for a very inexpensive amount of money. And that might be a good first step for people that are looking to get started that don't have an IT or security person to do that. So that might be a suggestion, is we match people up all the time with our MSP partners that have the ability to do those type of things. So as well, let me bring up one question that came up specifically about the vulnerability scanning that CISA offers. Does it require credentials?
No, everything we're doing is unauthenticated. Kind of gives you the adversary's look. So when you get a report from the web application scanning or vulnerability scanning, what I see, an adversary sees. That's very important, because authenticated scans will tell you more, but that doesn't mean the adversary can see that.
Perfect. We did get another question specifically, and I think it kind of ties to one of our first poll questions about vulnerability management. People were asking about, if I know what devices are on my network, how do I use that information to persuade my executives to get started?
So, a couple of things on that one. So, the bottom line is how do I get leadership buy-in? Again, we're in the business of making widgets, but I'm telling you, you've got devices that are insecure, and leadership's going, I don't care. We make widgets. How do I get them to understand this? Well, number one is there's enough data out there and enough stories in the news that are very clear. Small and mid-sized businesses are the low-hanging fruit, that adversaries are targeting, period. So what it comes down to is it's going to be a leadership decision at the end of the day. But there's a lot of reports out there, and I'm kind of a little biased towards the Verizon Barris report because it's a voluntary reporting mechanism where a lot of entities report a lot of incident data, and so it's objective because it's just here the entities are allowed to anonymously submit data, so it's real honest data, and I kind of like that report. But it shows you the breaches, it shows you how long they're on the network, how the breach started, talks about a lot of the damage that's done, and ultimately, this is a business decision, and when you go to leadership, you say, okay, I'm asking you to spend this amount of money for this, or change these things, or let's hire a person for this. Well, why should I do that? I can't see, return on investment through that. Fair point. It's how much am I preventing? How do you measure how much I'm preventing? Well, that's a very tough question. But I tell you what I can do. I can show you numbers that say if something happens, this is what it's going to cost you. And I've seen numbers on breaches, the average breach costing, an organization anywhere from $1 million to $3 million. So you can pull that data out and show leadership and say, look, this is a business case. You might not see the return on investment because we're not breached. But if you don't invest, we run that much of a greater risk of being breached. Ergo, you will then end up spending this much. So for leadership, a lot of times you need to put it in dollars and cents, and that's one way you can do it. Again, at the end of the day, they got to make a decision, and they're either going to spend the money, hire the body, make the changes, or not. I think though, if you're the IT, the CIO, CISO, there are going to be things you can do that are low cost, but at some point you're going to need to spend money, and that's where you need to go in with let me make the business case of why you need to do this. And if you don't get all of what you want, that's okay, because you can again at least lower your risk. Because we can also talk about organizations that spend a ton of money and still get breached. So even despite doing everything right, it doesn't mean you won't get breached. The idea is I just want to lower the probability that I'm going to get breached. And I need to do some things to do that. And the more I can do, the more I can lower that probability. And if you go to your leadership with the dollars and cents and a business case, you're more inclined to have success just versus just, we don't want to get breached, it's bad. Oh, okay, why is it bad? Well, we won't be able to use these systems. Okay, well, what would that mean? Well, now I can tell you we're going to lose. Production's going to be shut down. We're not going to be able to send, orders out. We're not going to be able to do this. It's going to cost us money, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, now I get it. So that's how I would approach that, because at the end of the day, it's very tough to convince people that don't do this for a living to see the day-to-day threat that is actually going on right now against you, small and mid-sized business.
So we've gotten a great response to this poll question. I'm going to leave it up just for a second while I ask one more question, and then we'll show the results to it. But I will tell you, almost 60% of the people, do weekly or monthly scans, but they are not doing them daily. So it's an interesting analysis that comes with it. We did get a question about what about free or low cost suggestions for those that are in the cloud and don't own their own IP block. And Stephen, if you could comment on that. And also, what about for the, obviously for the Wi-Fi's and the networks that are left behind that people are going to have to figure out how do they support those that probably all their IoT devices didn't move to the cloud?
So 2 questions. Back to the cloud. At the end of the day, anytime you hear the word cloud, just substitute other people's servers, because that's what it is. You may not own the bare metal that your software is sitting on, or whatever your data, whatever is sitting on, but there is bare metal out there, and that bare metal, has because there's other customers probably sitting on that bare metal with you. And so, with that being said, ultimately, there are things you can do to configure your cloud so that it's trusted connections from, your internet devices accessing it. And, you hear a lot of things like, like S3 bucket misconfigurations, that people were able to get to the data. Okay, that's a configuration issue. That's one thing. That's the part of the infrastructure that you can control, or did you outsource that? Okay, and there are assessments that look for those misconfigurations. That's different than, like, I'll use the web application. So the web application scanning is, let's say you're on Amazon Cloud or Azure or whatever, and they've spun you up some machines, or you own the machines and you've installed your web app, your web server on there. It's going to be seamless from the administrator's perspective. They're going to log in to the dev side or the back end of the administrator accounts, and they're going to configure things, and they're going to make things live, not live. It doesn't really matter per se where that's hosted. It's just the difference is just whose iron is it sitting on. Now with the iron, though, again, that introduces a little different problem, because you're dependent on the third party to manage, the core operating system that's running that piece of iron. And there is a public IP address. You don't own the public IP address, and it doesn't directly map to your website. DNS will route it and all that stuff. We won't get into all that, but nonetheless, you can't scan that IP address for vulnerabilities. You're assuming that the third party that owns the cloud instance is doing that. So you can, in your service level agreements, can you have those requirements in there that say, hey, listen, you're going to host us, you have certain things you got to do. However, it's still our content, so we own that, so we have things we've got to do. Or maybe you've outsourced the whole thing. Nonetheless, regardless, it's still software on iron. What part do you own? And it's not going to be that different whether you own the app sitting in your DMZ or whether it's sitting on someone else's piece of iron. And then the iron, it's either a third party managing it or you're managing it. The only thing about cloud is it does introduce some nuances in how it's configured. And I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in cloud architecture, but I know enough to know that you can misconfigure and show data in the cloud that's not meant to be public, that maybe should be, authentication required. And that goes back to okay, if I have a pen tester looking at my infrastructure, even though we're cloud-based, they still need to assess that. Now, with respect to what's left behind, okay, I've gotten rid of all of my major data hosting. It's out in the cloud. My web apps are in the cloud. My file servers, it's all out in the cloud. Got it. My email server, all in the cloud. However, I still have employees showing up to work, logging on a computer, which means I still have switches probably in the office. I still probably have some routers in the office, and I still have to have an internet service connection in the office, which means maybe I still have to have some kind of firewall. So it doesn't really change anything. I've just simply taken a big part of what I'll call my operations, and instead of keeping it on premise, I've just moved it to someone else's pieces of metal. And then my employees come on site, and instead of logging into the server closet down on the first floor or the second floor, they're simply logging in to the server that's physically virtualized in a cloud environment that someone else is hosting for me. So I don't think it changes anything, really. I mean, you're still going to own some of that, but then you've got to decide, since I went to the cloud, what did I offload to them, the third party, to be responsible for, versus what are we saying we're going to continue to own this? So that's all organizationally dependent on how you've done that. I mean, I've seen everything from organizations said, it's all yours, third party, to some say, just get me a piece of iron, we're going to spin up, we'll spin up our own VMs. And in some cases, I won't say where that's at, but in some cases, it's literally they took their servers and simply moved it into into the data warehouse, essentially a cloud provider, and said, we're going to own the iron. You just connect, your connectivity into our pieces of iron. So I've seen it all, but ultimately it comes down to, what do you own? What are you holding the third party responsible for? And then how are you assessing whether the third party is doing what they're supposed to do or not?
So It's interesting that came up. We actually have a university that's a customer of ours that has transitioned everything to Azure. But interestingly enough, left behind were all the cameras on campus, all the doorbells on campus, all the printers on campus. And they still have a huge network of things that they have got to scan to make sure they stay on top of those. So it's an interesting point about, even though all the servers moved to Azure, the whole world for them has not moved to Azure. Taking that one step further, we did get a question about how SMBs control third-party risk in supply chain management with everything that's going on right now. And if you could talk to that for a couple minutes about small businesses, that would be great.
So this is a great question, because at the end of the day, I'm going to tell you Steve's opinion. As a third party, unless, again, this is my opinion, if you are working with other entities, and let's say there's some kind of manufacturing, something develop what they're doing for you, in your contracts, you can theoretically put requirements in there that say, you will implement certain, security protocols. You will vet employees that have access to the data. You will do all of these things if they own that piece. Now they have it. Then they have a choice. They can say, you know what, we want your business, so we're going to comply with that. We're going to make sure that we meet, stringent security controls. We're going to make sure that our employees are vetted. We're going to make sure all of these things, and then in theory that gives you a little more confidence than in your suppliers. Problem: a lot of what we buy is made in a country that's not necessarily our bestest buddy. So if you flip your device over and say, where is this thing made? Got it. No secret, most of this stuff is made in China. And I'm not even going to get into that. But nonetheless, if you have any control over your supply chain, then you probably want to say, I want certain controls put in place. But you can't just say, I want these things in place. You have to have a way to, how do I evaluate that it's actually being done? It might shock you, but some businesses don't always tell the truth in how they operate. So you can control what you can control. But if you're going to just buy stuff, like, hey, we're going to buy 100 laptops from Dell, and you're getting 100 laptops from Dell, and wherever they get them, they get them. Now, if you say to Dell, you say, listen, Dell, and I'm just using Dell as an example. You say, listen, Dell, we're going to buy the laptops, but we want guarantees on this, this, and this. Dell has a choice of saying, we're not going to do that, or, okay, we can do that. And if they say we're not going to do that, then you have the choice of saying, well, we need the laptops, I got to buy it, or, then I'm going to go somewhere else who can give me this. A lot of times, the small and mid-sized companies are usually in the supply chain because you're probably manufacturing something, or you're some kind of meeting your third party, or some kind of coordinating entity, something. And so you're having some kind of input, whatever it is, and you're obviously producing some kind of output. So if you have control over the input and can put requirements in there, then it's probably not a bad idea to do that. And then also have a way to check that. However, sometimes we all have to go and buy our equipment from, the manufacturers. And until enough people say, I don't want my goods made there anymore, the goods are going to continue to be made there. And there's not much we can do about it. So this is where you as industry have to drive those requirements and say, I am not going to keep buying stuff because I don't trust where it's coming from. And until enough people raise that stink, they're going to say, then go somewhere else, because we've got enough customers that want to buy it. So that's Steve's 2 cents.
So we do have one more poll question that I'd like people to respond to around managed service providers. I mean, we think it's critically important that end users and small organizations specifically have managed service providers that can help them locally, have a relationship with them, help them with all the issues that they're facing. So one of the things we ask on every one of these is specifically about the managed service provider to handle your needs and where people are on that. If people can respond to that, we'll certainly get you the answers to those questions as well. And then while people are answering that question, Steve, maybe you can talk a little bit specifically about some maybe additional services or around CMMC specifically and compliance, if there's things that CISA might be doing to help in that area.
So there are a lot of services that CISA offers, everything from remote pen testing to validated architecture reviews. Obviously some of the SciHy services. But we're not going to certify you, but we can certainly give you the tools that get you closer to being certified. So I'm kind of dancing around this for a reason, because there's a lot of things. Because when you say compliance, again, to me, it's like, what do you mean by that? Because like there's a lot of stuff that's involved in that. It's everything from technical to procedural to everything to human resources. So to be compliant with a lot of these, CISA offers a lot of the knowledge, a lot of the tools, coupled with like a lot of the NIST manuals that are out there. So there's a lot out there that will get you to whatever compliance. I can help them answering this too. Whatever compliance you're aiming for. But like our services in and of themselves are not going to do it for you. They're just going to help you get there, if that makes sense.
It does. Hey, we are at the top of the hour. I want to make sure we accommodate everybody's calendar responsibilities. If you have additional questions, please put them into our LinkedIn event program, and we'll get back to you. We will have a schedule for this available. It will be on YouTube, so you'll have the ability to watch the rebroadcast of it. If you contact us, we can get you a link to that as well. And then, as we said, we have these upcoming events, specifically public service announcements in mind to help small businesses as they move forward, what they can do to get help, how they can partner with an MSP, and what they can do to move towards compliance, as well as how do you handle the remote and hybrid workforces. So it is the top of the hour. I want to thank everybody for their time today. I want to thank you for participating. And we look forward to the next conversation. And if there's an opportunity to communicate on LinkedIn and participate in our LinkedIn event, we'd like to have you there sharing and connecting and collaborating on these issues together. We're only going to get through this if we can all work on this together. So thanks so much for your time. Stephen, thanks for participating. And we will continue to provide more information from CISA and the other federal agencies as our webinars roll out. So with that, thank you for your time, and everybody have a great morning and a great afternoon. Thanks, Stephen.
Bye-bye.